Section 6.1, Roots and Radical Expressions. Today, students will be able to find the nth roots. The nth roots. If a to the n equals b, there are two scenarios. The first scenario is if n is odd. If n is odd, the answer is going to be written as the nth root of b. There is just one answer. The second scenario is if n is even, and if that's the case, there is going to be two answers. It's positive and negative nth root of b. There is two answers. Let's look at our first example. So it's asking what are the real fifth roots of 0, 1, and 32. Okay, so fifth, that's what our n is. 5 is an odd number, so there's only going to be one answer to these problems. So the fifth root of 0 is 0 still. The fifth root of 1 is 1, and the fifth root of 32 is 2. Press pause and practice finding the real square roots of 0.01, -1, and 36 over 121. Since in this problem the n is a square root, which is even, it means that there's going to be two answers. So the square root of 0.01 is plus or minus 0.1. The square root of a negative number cannot happen, so there is no real square root. I know that you know about the imaginary numbers, but since this section was just asking for you to find all the real roots, there isn't a real root, it's imaginary. The last example, the square root of 36 over 121 means that you take the square root of the top, and then you take the square root of the bottom. So the square root of 36 is 6, the square root of 121 is 11, and then since it's even, it's plus or it's minus. Okay, so now we are just going to be finding the roots, which is a little different than finding just the real roots. So in this first example, the problem is written as the cube root of -27. In the last two examples we did, it was like a word problem and you had to set up the radical. Since the radical is already given to you in all of these examples in this section, there is going to be no plus or minus, okay? So all what you're going to do is think of what the cube root of -27 is, and the cube root of -27 is -3. You can take a negative number can be under your radical as long as the index is an odd number. Okay, let's look at our second example. So this time we're going to be taking the fourth root of -81. Since our index is even and underneath is a negative number, we know that that's going to be imaginary, so we just are going to write that there is no real root. Alright, it's your turn to practice. Press pause, and I want you to take the square root of -7 to the second power and the square root of -49. The square root of -7 squared, okay? -7 squared gives me positive 49, and the square root of positive 49 gives me 7. And then to take the square root of a negative number, you cannot do, so you say that there is no real root. The nth root of nth powers. So if you notice at this first example, this is an n and that's an n. So since they're the same thing, they would cancel out. So I would be just left with a. That is going to be true only if n is an odd number. The same thing is true. Again, nth root of something to the nth power, which is going to have it simplify to just a, but we have to put absolute value bars around a if n is even. Example 5, we have the square root of 81 x to the fourth. So we're going to take the square root of them separately. So the square root of 81 is 9. The square root of x to the fourth is x squared. And then, since n is even, there should be absolute value bars around all of that. In this scenario, though, the number 9 is always going to stay the number 9. And x squared, if you plug any number in for x, once you square it, it's going to make it positive. So this final answer simplified is 9x squared. Press pause and try example 6, the cube root of a to the 12th times b to the 15th. Alright, so you're taking the cube root of both of them separately. So I think, how many times does 3 go into 12? So that's going to give me a to the 4th. How many times does 3 go into 15? And that's going to give me b to the 5th. Since n is odd, this is going to be my answer. I don't need any absolute value bars. Our last example, we're going to take the fourth root of x to the 12th, y to the 16th. So how many times does 4 go into 12? 3 times. How many times does 4 go into 16? 4 times. Since n is even, this needs absolute value bars around it, okay? X to the third power, if you were to plug in a negative number, that could still give you a negative answer, so it needs to keep the absolute value bars around it. Y to the fourth power, if you plug any number in for y, it's going to become positive since it's being raised to an even exponent. So you only need absolute value bars around odd exponents when it comes from an even radical. So even radical, odd exponents need absolute value bars.